Welcome to Magnificat TV news program dedicated to providing news from the Church. Today is Wednesday, April 17th, 2024, and these are our headlines. Doctrine of the Faith has published a document on human dignity, Dignitas Infinita, which among other things condemns gender ideology. Reactions to the Vatican document on human dignity have been numerous, both from conservatives and liberals. Cardinal Sarah has praised African bishops for opposing the blessings of homosexual couples, allowed in Fiducia Supplicans. The European Parliament has approved by a large majority a recommendation to the member states to include the right to abortion in their constitutions. Dignitas Infinita is the title of the document published by the Doctrine of the Faith, presided over by Cardinal Fernandez, dedicated to the defense of human dignity. The document published by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith does not seek to be exhaustive, both in delving into the reasons for human dignity and in denouncing the aggressions it suffers, but it points out the most important in one aspect and in the other. The Church, the Vatican document states, proclaims the equal dignity of all human beings, regardless of their condition in life or their quality of life. This proclamation rests on a threefold conviction, which in the light of the Christian faith, confers an immeasurable value on human dignity and reinforces its intrinsic demands. Without the corrective help of religion, reason can also fall prey to distortions, as when it is manipulated by ideologies or applied in a partial way to the detriment of the full consideration of the dignity of the human person. After all, it was such abuse of reason that led to the slave trade and the spread of the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century. It must be recognized that it's opposed to human dignity everything that threatens life: homicide of any kind, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, and even deliberate suicide. It is also against our dignity everything that violates the integrity of the human person, such as mutilation, moral or physical torture, and systematic attempts to dominate the minds of others. Also, opposed to such dignity are subhuman living conditions, arbitrary detention, deportation, slavery, prostitution, trafficking in women and children, and degrading working conditions that reduce the workers to the status of mere instrument for profit, with no respect for the freedom and responsibility of the human person. The document denounces some serious violations that are particularly relevant today: poverty, war, migrant labor conditions, human trafficking, sexual abuse, violence against women, abortion, surrogacy, euthanasia, and assisted suicide, the discarding of persons with disability, gender ideology, sex change, the persecution of homosexuals in some countries, and digital violence. He also confronts the question of the elaboration of a new human rights that are not such. At times, the concept of human dignity is also abused to justify an arbitrary multiplication of new rights, many of which are often contrary to those originally defined and not infrequently contradict the fundamental right to life. It is very hard on gender ideology, of which it says it pretends to deny the greatest possible difference between living beings: sexual difference. This constitutive difference is not only the greatest imaginable, but also the most beautiful and the most powerful. It achieves, in the male-female couple, the most admirable reciprocity, and it's therefore the source of the miracle that never ceases to amaze us, which is the arrival of a new human beings into the world. Both conservatives and liberals have reacted critically to the Vatican document on human dignity. Dignitas Infinita has left no one indifferent. For the liberals, it has been very disappointing, and they have expressed their criticisms in a very harsh way. One example is the reaction of the group New Ways Ministry, which accompanies active homosexuals and transsexuals. Its director, who was recently received by the Pope and came away exultant from the interview, has published this press release. The Vatican's new document, Dignitas Infinita, fails terribly in offering transgender and non-binary people not infinite, but limited human dignity. While it lays out a wonderful justification for why every human being, regardless of his or her status in life, should be respected, honored, and loved, it fails to apply this principle to gender-diverse people. The Vatican's arguments and conclusions about gender identity and gender transitions indicate that the authors have not consulted the advances in the biological, psychological, and social sciences on gender. Worse, it shows that the authors did not listen carefully to the lived experience of people who have discovered, often after painful and torturous journeys, that God has naturally created them with a gender identity beyond societal expectations, usually based on physical appearance. This organization further accuses the Vatican of supporting and propagating ideas that lead to actual physical harm to transgender, non-binary, and other LGBTQ+ people. They are harmed by the very violence that this document condemns in economic, psychological, spiritual, social, and most tragically, physical ways, resulting in serious harms that often leads to death. It should also be remembered that the president of this organization is the nun Jeannie Gramick, who was condemned by Benedict XVI for her heterodox writings and teachings and was subsequently rehabilitated by Pope Francis. Very harsh is also the assessment made by the Spanish nun Teresa Forcades. For a queer theology, the way in which Dignitas Infinita deals with gender ideology, abortion, surrogacy, euthanasia, and suicide is unsatisfactory because it is the doctrinaire and not very nuanced. Finally, the paragraph on sex change seems to me a scandal that should never have been published. From the conservative sector, Tommaso Scandroio considers it a superficial document with some serious errors. The basic approach of a metaphysical nature is in principle correct, but given the value of the document, it needed further deepening, for example, dealing with the concept of person in relation to the 3 points of the Holy Trinity. Scandroio, who writes in the Italian digital La Nuova Bussola Quotidiana, also sees missing topics, conspicuous by the absence are divorce, contraception, artificial insemination, experimentation with embryos, and environmentalism. Robert Royal, writing in The Catholic Thing, points out some shortcomings. For example, the text says, "It is very difficult today to invoke the rational criteria developed in previous centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war." To which Royal responds, "However, Ukraine is fighting a just war, and it will not be the last, as long as there is human evil on earth." On gender ideology, Royal states, affirming human dignity will not stop the raids of the Rainbow Warriors. The only thing likely to reverse the destructive threats is a church in a much more militant stance. There is little real fight in the declaration, especially given the current moment, when militant activists of various stripes must be effectively resisted. Cardinal Sarah, Prefect Emeritus for the Dicastery for the Divine Worship, has thanked the African bishops for their opposition to the blessing of homosexual couples. Cardinal Sarah, on a visit to Cameroon, has asked the African bishops to be a spearhead in the next session of the Synod on Synodality, opposing the female diaconate, married priests, new sexual morality. It is a matter of continuing to act in line with the strong resistance of the Church in Africa against the blessing of same-sex couples, authorized by the Vatican Declaration Fiducia Supplicans last December. Some in the West, said Sarah, wanted to make people believe that they were acting in the name of African culture particularism. It is false and ridiculous to attribute such purposes to you. Some claim that Africans were not yet ready to bless homosexual couples for cultural reasons, as if the West is ahead of the retrograde Africans. They would like to allow the female diaconate in Germany, married priests in Belgium, the confusion between ordained priesthood and baptismal priesthood in Amazonia. Some recently appointed theological experts make no secret of their plans, and they will tell you with false kindness. Rest assured that in Africa we will not impose this kind of innovation on you. You are not culturally prepared. But we, successors of the apostles, were ordained not to promote and defend our cultures, but the universal unity of the faith. Act with your words, bishops of Cameroon, in the name of the truth of the gospel, and for the sake of human dignity and the salvation of all humanity in Christ. This truth is the same in Europe, as well as in Africa and in the United States. Many Western prelates are paralyzed at the idea of opposing the world, he added. They dream of being loved by the world. Perhaps excessive material wealth leads to compromises with worldly affairs. Poverty is a guarantee of being free for God. I believe that the church of our time experiences a temptation of fluid and practical atheism. Maybe they tell you that this is the way the world is made and you can escape it. Perhaps you will be told that the church must adapt or die. You must be told that, if the fundamentals are secure, you must be flexible with the details. We must not give in to the lies. The essence of fluid atheism is the promise of a compromise between truth and lies. It is the greatest temptation of our time. The European Parliament has voted in favor of its member states including abortion as a fundamental right in their constitutions. With 336 votes in favor, 163 against, and 39 abstentions, members of the European Parliament approved a resolution calling for abortion to be included in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which sets out the rights, freedoms, and principles recognized in the member states. The resolution in favor of including abortion in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union on Thursday, promoted by the Liberal Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Left, states that controlling the reproductive lives and deciding whether, when, and how to have children is essential for the full realization of human rights for women. They justify their position by appealing to some UN documents that call for defending the individual decision to seek voluntary termination of pregnancy. But the motion also pointed to France's recent decision to enshrine abortion in its constitution as an example to follow. Members of the European Parliament are concerned about the significant increase in funding for anti-abortion groups around the world, including in the Union. They call on the Commission to ensure that pro-life organizations do not receive funding from the Union. The text adopted by the European Parliament explicitly criticizes some of the EU member states, such as Poland, Malta, Slovakia, Hungary, for having more conservative policies on abortion than most. It urges governments in Europe to make abortion methods and procedures a compulsory part of the curriculum for doctors and medical students. This vote in the European Parliament is not enough to change the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, but it is a demand from the legislative chamber to the 27 countries, known as the European Council, to amend the Charter. This change to the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights would only be possible if all 27 member states agree. The governments of the countries where life of the unborn is most protected, such as Malta, Hungary, or Poland, are not expected to give their approval in the near future. Our editorial this week is dedicated to commenting on the document Dignitas Infinita and the reactions against it in the liberal sector.
Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, presided over by Cardinal Fernandez, has published this week an important document, Dignitas Infinita, dedicated to expose, denounce, condemn, it should be said, those behaviors that seriously violate human dignity. And it is a good thing that the document is about human dignity and not about human rights that we are seeing that are so easily manipulated. Of course, the document is not perfect, and it could certainly have been done differently and more elaborated on some points. But it is really an important document, which is to be welcomed and appreciated. And in order to understand what I am saying, I believe that we must look at 3 points. First, what the document says. One cannot evaluate it if one does not know what it says. Second, who has been bothered, or at least who has been most bothered by this document. And third, who has written this document and what importance it has for the future. Let's go to the first point. What does Dignitas Infinita say? I have selected some ideas. They are phrases, most of the things I am going to read. Verbatim from the document. The Church proclaims the equal dignity of human rights, regardless of their condition in life or their quality of life. This proclamation is based on a triple conviction, which in the light of the Christian faith, confers an immeasurable value on human dignity and reinforces its intrinsic demands. It is right to say immeasurable value, not infinite value as could be inferred from the title, because God alone is infinite. Immeasurable is already very much. Without the corrective help of religion, the text adds, reason could also fall prey to distortions, as when it's manipulated by ideologies or applied in a partial way to the detriment of the full consideration of the human dignity of the human person. After all, such abuse of human rights or reason was what caused the slave trade in the first place, and many other social evils, in particular, the spread of the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century. There is a natural law imprinted in our DNA, like our fingerprint imprinted in human nature, a natural moral law, but it is easily manipulated and we are suffering it not only now, the document speaks of. For example, the justification of slavery or those totalitarian ideologies, which it does not mention, but which are in the 20th century, Nazism and communism. And that is why revelation is important, because it is the revelation that does not allow itself to be bribed, because it is the untouchable message of God. It is fundamental to be very clear about this for a Catholic, even for the German bishops. It must be recognized. The text goes on to say that it is opposed to human dignity, whatever is against life, and it cites some cases: homicide of any kind, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, and even deliberate suicide. It is also contrary to our dignity whatever violates the integrity of human person, such as mutilations, moral or physical torture, systematic attempt to dominate the minds of others, and finally, whatever offends human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary detentions, exploitations, slavery, prostitution, trafficking in human and young people, or degradation and degrading working conditions that reduce the worker to the rank of a mere instrument of profit, without respect for the freedom and responsibility of the human person. This is not an exhaustive analysis, nor does the document claim to be, but it would be too detailed. But I believe that the essential things have been said here. But there is still more. The document denounces some serious violations of that human dignity that are particularly up to date: poverty, war, the working condition of migrants, human trafficking, sexual abuse, violence against women, abortion, surrogate wombs. Those who have been hurt by this phrase have already cited and cried out to heaven, but I don't know whether to heaven or to hell. The document condemns surrogacy, parental wombs. It goes on to say euthanasia and assisted suicide, the discarding of people with disabilities, and here comes perhaps what has caused the most controversy, which has most angered the alleged or self-proclaimed friends of the Pope: gender ideology, sex change, the persecution suffered in some countries by homosexuals, and dignita violence. It clearly condemns without any justification surrogacy, wombs for rent, as well as gender ideology. I am quoting only a few sentences because each of these sentences then developed what it does so, and also condemns sex change. The document also tackles the question of the elaboration of new human rights that are not such. Literal quotation. Sometimes the concept of the human dignity is also abused to justify an arbitrary multiplication of new rights, many of which are often contrary to those originally defined, and not frequently put in contradiction with the fundamental right to life. We must remember that he is talking obviously among other things, but obviously he is talking about abortion, euthanasia, which he has already cited as very serious violations of human dignity. But this is what he is doing at a time when a country like France has just included abortion as a human right in its constitution, and the European Parliament 2 days after the publication of this document. This very week, therefore, has approved by a majority, not unanimously, not unanimously, but by a majority and a large majority, the recommendation that all the states of European Union include abortion as a right in their constitutions. Of course, it is not going to be put into practice, and it is not going to be put into practice because unanimity would be necessary, and it is not going to happen. But it is very significant, and that is why this reference made in the document is important. Although it does not mention it as perhaps it should be mentioned it. This reference to these new supposed human rights that contradict the previous right and that also contradict the fundamental right, which is the right to life. The document is very hard on abortion and also on gender ideology, of which it says that gender ideology presents and pretend to deny the greatest possible difference between living beings, the sexual difference. This constitutive reference is not only the greatest imaginable, but also the most beautiful and the most powerful. It achieves in the male-female couple the most admirable reciprocity and is therefore the source of that miracle that never ceases to amaze us, which is the arrival of new human beings into the world. Not all things have upset, infuriated, I would even dare to say, those who present themselves as the Pope's friends. They present themselves as the Pope's friends well, and of course they are allowed to take smiling pictures with them, which gives reason to believe that what they say is true. But it is clear that with this document there is no doubt that beyond gestures of welcoming hugs and smiles, beyond those gestures there is a profound discrepancy of opinions. For example, the reaction of that group, New Way Ministries Association, which supposedly, I repeat, has been supported by the Pope because the nun who founded it has been welcomed in the Vatican, and the condemnation given by Pope Benedict XVI has been lifted, and because after that president of the association said that Pope Francis was absolutely in agreement with the practice of homosexuality, well, after this document against gender ideology, against sex change, they have made this statement. The New Vatican document, Dignitas Infinitas, fails terribly. These are the words of the Pope's supposed friends. It fails terribly in offering transgender and non-binary people not infinite by limited human dignity. While it lays out a wonderful justification for why every human being, regardless of his or her status in life, should be respected, honored, and loved, it fails to apply this principle to gender-diverse people. The Vatican's arguments and conclusions about gender identity and gender transitions indicate that the authors have not consulted the advances in the biological, psychological, and social sciences on gender. Worse, New Way continue. It shows that the author did not listen carefully to the lived experience of people who have often discovered, after painful and torturous journeys, that God has naturally created them with gender identity beyond the social expectations normally based on physical appearance. They are really angry, and it is a disqualification, not total, to the document. They don't mess with other things, but as far as they are concerned. But there's more. They further accuse the Vatican of, quote unquote, supporting and propagating ideas that leads to actual physical harm to transgender, non-binary, and other LGBTQ+ people. The document explicitly says that it condemns any kind of violence against people who are homosexual or even practice their homosexuality. It should be remembered that there are countries in Africa, but also Muslim countries, where this is punishable, even with imprisonment or sometimes even death. The document is very clear in the condemnation, but then it seems very little, and they even accuse the Vatican of giving arguments for this violence to continue. According to this organization, they are harmed by the same violence that this document condemns in economic, psychological, spiritual, social, and most tragically physical ways, which causes serious harm, often leading to death. This hunger is so great that they accuse the Vatican of being a collaborator in the economic, psychological, spiritual, social, and most tragically, physical repression against homosexuals. Those with homosexual tendencies or who practice homosexuality. This is more than an anger, it is an accusation and a declared rapture. We must also remember, as I have said before, that the known benign Gremic, condemned by Benedict XVI for his writings and heterodox teaching, was rehabilitated by Pope Francis as a gesture of reconciliation, of goodwill, and now that organization founded by her, not presided over by her at this time, is the one making these harsh accusations against the Vatican, Cardinal Fernandez, and even the Pope. But it has not only been them in the United States. In Italy, the reaction has been very similar. Even in Spain, there has been the reaction of a Benedictine nun, Sister Teresa Forcades, a woman who also presents herself as a very close friend to Pope Francis. There is no lack of photographs that confirm this. And this woman, this nun, has made a public document, a critical note against Dignitas Infinita. This is what it literally says. For a cruel theology, she speaks of the one she develops. She has a book dedicated to this, the way in which Dignitas Infinita approaches the ideology of gender, abortion, surrogacy, euthanasia, and suicide in unsatisfactory. For Sister Teresa, not only gender ideology or sex change is not correct, as the Vatican says, but she includes in her reasons for dissatisfaction. These are the words she uses: abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide. Also for her, the Vatican condemned these things as very serious violations of human dignity, is unsatisfactory, and asks why it is unsatisfactory. Because this document, this condemnation is doctrinary and little nuanced. Finally, Sister Teresa continues, the paragraph on sex change seems to me to be a scandal that should never be published. They are not angry, they are furious. They were not the only ones. Also, the German Bishops' Conference has made it known that they do not like the document at all. But it is certainly cannot be said that the German bishops are friends. At this moment, they are among the disappointed friends, because they have been ceased to be friends of the Pope. At least in some aspects, even if officially they still present themselves as such, and say officially that they do not want the rupture. Third point, why this document is important. Who has written it? It's a document of the theological Ratzinger of the Pontiff Pope John Paul II, of the Pontiff Pope Benedict XVI. No, it is a document of Cardinal Fernandez, not even of Cardinal Adaria, for example, or Cardinal Muller, who has been prefect of the doctrine of faith with Pope Francis. It is a document by Cardinal Fernandez, whose closeness to the Pope is very known. A document signed by Cardinal Fernandez, endorsed by the Pope explicitly. And what does this mean? That it is tomorrow. If tomorrow someone wants to modify some of these things and say abortion, euthanasia, sex change, surrogate motherhood, gender ideology, any of these things that the document condemns, these things are more or less acceptable. He is going to find himself going not against Pope John Paul II, not against Benedict, but against Francis. His friends, I have always said that with friends like this, there is no need for enemies. His so-called friends say that he is the Pope. They are the ones who say it, that he is the Pope who wants to apply the Second Vatican Council a hermeneutica of rupturo, that he is the Pope of the new church, that he is the Pope who is willing to change sexual morality of the church and other things as well. That is what his so-called friend says. Those who are very angry, well, if you go against some of the things that this document condemns, that is to say, in favor of these things, you are going against Pope Francis. It is true that it can be said, well, dogma evolves, and therefore, if a year or 2 years ago it was said that this was wrong, today we are smarter than 2 years ago, and we say that it is right. It is true that it can be said, it has already been said, it is the issue of the blessing of homosexual or heterosexual couples who do not live together in marriage. It has already been said also, but to repeat the same argument twice is going to be very difficult, because it will clearly show the official installation, not unofficial but official, of relativism in the church. There will be absolutely nothing from the moment that the church says that she can be taken seriously, because what today is bad, tomorrow, with that trick or that excuse of the evolution of dogma, can be said to be good. Who is going to take something seriously, something that not even those who defend it are willing to maintain a defense over time? Saint Vincent de Lawrence, who spoke of the evolution of dogma, is often quoted, and this French saint is very interesting. An interesting saint also because he was accused of semi-Pelagianism. Saint Vincent de Lawrence, who lived in the 5th century, not in the 20th century, says the document can also and must indeed evolve. And he establishes two categories, the category of progress and the category of change in the dogma. And progress, which is what he defends, is when dogma evolves without betraying, without denying what came before. Change is when dogma evolves, contradicting what came before. Change is unacceptable, progress is acceptable. At the time of Saint Vincent de Lawrence, or until relatively recently, one could not speak of gender ideology because it did not exist, of surrogate wombs because they did not exist either, or in vitro fertilization because it did not exist, of genetic manipulation because it does not exist. Dogma evolves by progressing when it does not betray what came before. Dogma evolves by betraying, by changing when the previous is changed. To change this is not going to be so. If someone pretends it is so that way, an unacceptable and an acceptable evolution of the dogma is going to be a change and to betray and a betrayal to the document. I insist, it's not a perfect document, and some have already taken out some points that could have been improved according to their opinion. It is a very acceptable document. It is a document to be welcomed, and it is a document to be appreciated. Until next week, God's willing.
We will continue to keep you informed of what is happening in the church. In the meantime, you can check our website at www.magnificat.tv. See you next week, God willing.